So today we are going to continue with our Excel training and look at the use of a function called VLOOKUP. Now, to be successful with VLOOKUP, I need to make sure that you're already confident in understanding cell references. And by that, I mean, if there's a cell, you can look at the row and the column and see what reference the cell is. You need to be confident with creating simple formula, and you need to be confident with dragging the formulas. You know, when you find the small black cross in the corner and you drag down. So if you're comfortable with those skills, we can move on to looking at the VLOOKUP function. So the V in VLOOKUP stands for vertical. And the VLOOKUP is a cross-referencing tool that can search a table of data to find the result that you want and drag it back into the piece of work that you're doing. Now, that can be hard to conceptualize and hard to explain without seeing it being used and really understanding how it can be useful. So we're going to do lots of practical examples in this course to illustrate it. But before we even start with VLOOKUP, we need to understand something called absolute references. And what an absolute reference does is it fixes the cell reference of a given cell so that it remains unchanged no matter where that formula moves. So a normal cell reference, for example, would be A1 here. But once we fix it, we add these dollar signs so that it becomes here $A, $1, and that is called an absolute reference. So we'll look at how to actually apply those dollar signs shortly. But first of all, let's look at an example so that you can try and understand why using an absolute reference might be useful. So in this example, we have a simple formula applied. We've been asked to multiply the amounts in column D here times 3. And so what we've done is we've added a new column with 3 each time. And then in column G, you can see that we've just put in these simple formula, and I've just expanded them out here so that you can see them. So we've simply done D9 times F9 equals G9 here, 30,000. And so it continues down. So now let me ask you a question. If we now wanted to multiply by 4 instead of 3, what would we do? So we could use find and replace, which we've learnt in previous courses. We could highlight all the instances here of 3 and press Control F and find 3 and replace it with 4. That would work. We could also type 4 in the top row, find the cross and drag it down, and that would also work. But what I want to show you is how an absolute reference is a fantastic tool for this job. So let's look at an example. So here we have the simple formula versus absolute reference. And you can see now that instead of there being an additional column with the 3s in it, we just have one cell here with a 3 in it. And that is cell I7, okay? So now if we move down to each result here, you can see that I've expanded out the formulas again. And so this time, D8 is multiplied by I7 to equal 30,000. In the next one, D9 is multiplied by I7 to equal 30,000. Then in this one, we have D10 times I7 to equal 225, etc., etc. So you can see that each time the amount is being multiplied by that absolute reference, that fixed reference, which is cell I7, and at the moment contains the number 3. Therefore, if we suddenly wanted to multiply it by 4, the simple thing we could do is literally just change that cell I7 from 3 to 4, and that would do the work for us. So let's just have a look at that in the formula. So before, the reference in column F changed in every formula, but now the $ fixes that reference, and so every number multiplies by that fixed reference. So let's go and look at those in Excel. So here's those examples that we're talking about. So the first example, we have multiplied simply by inserting a column with 3 in it. So if I look at the formula here, I have D8 multiplied by F8, which contains the 3, and I have my result there. And as I look down, let's look at one more. I can see that this is D12 times 3 in the F12 cell, and I have my result there. So now if I wanted to multiply by 4 instead, we looked at the 2 options. So the first thing I could do is I could highlight all the 3's, I could control find 3, I could replace with 4, replace all, and that job is done. Alternately, I could replace that 3 with a 4, and I'll just do a second one as well, so that now when I grab them together and find the cross and drag, Excel knows that I want all 4s because I've given it enough information. So I'll drag that down. In this example here, you can see that we have our absolute reference. So here we have I7, and that has the $ around it. So it is the fixed reference, the absolute reference. So if I continue to look down my formulas, that's still linked to I7, still linked to I7, still linked to I7. And so what that means is now, if I change my absolute reference here to 4, all the formulas immediately change. So I'll just undo and watch the column again as I change that to 4, and you can see what happens. There we go. Now that we've seen an example of how the absolute reference works, we need to learn how to add in that $ into the formula. And so here's a couple of options for you. So once the formula is in the formula bar, you can simply go in and manually enter your $. The second option is that if you highlight the cell reference in the formula bar that you want to fix, if you highlight it and press Function and F4 together, that will add both $. Just a word of caution, if anybody is using a Mac, an Apple, the Function F4 can be different keys. So if anybody doesn't get that to work, you just need to find out what the option is for your computer. But let's look at doing those in a practical example. So back in this example, let's look at how we apply the absolute reference. So I'm going to start with a simple formula, clicking in the cell where I want the result to be. So equals, and I'm selecting D8 multiplied by I7, which is where my absolute reference is going to be. So now I need to highlight I7, and note that I'm just highlighting the cell reference I7. I'm not capturing the asterisks before, and if there was brackets or commas. You must make sure you only capture the cell reference. And then I have two options. I can either click in here and start manually adding in my dollar signs. And if I press 3 here, we'll just check that it's working. There we go. And the other option I have is, if I delete those, the other option I have is to highlight just the I7, and I do function F4. And now I can drag that reference down. And each time I look in the formulas, I can see that that I7 is now fixed because it has those dollar signs in. So time to have a go at that for yourself by trying the exercises on apply an absolute. So here's the exercises that we were asked to do on applying an absolute reference. So let's have a look. So exercise 1, multiply by 5 using an inserted column. So this is just like the example that we did in our notes. So the first thing I'm going to do is click and make sure that I'm in the frame, and I'm going to right click and insert my column, and then I'm going to enter in my 5s. And in fact, I'm doing that in a slow way. I, of course, could highlight and drag down. Now I'm going to start a simple formula here. Just got a spelling mistake there. I'm going to put in equals, and I want to multiply my amount. So that's D7, and multiply that by F7, where my 5 is. And now I can find my cross and drag that formula down. And there we go. In the next exercise, I'm asked to multiply by 5, this time using the absolute reference. So I'll start again with my formula. So in the cell where I want the result to be, I press my equals. And again, I want the amount D7 and multiply. And this time I'm going to multiply it by this cell I6, where I have my absolute reference. And I'll put my 5 in so that I can see it work. Now I have the two options. I can either go in here and start manually putting in my dollar signs, or the option I much prefer is to highlight the cell reference and remember just the cell reference. And I'm going to press function F4. And now you can see that I have my dollar signs fixed. So now I'm going to find my cross and drag that down as well. And there I have it. So let's look at these next exercises. I was asked to change the formula in the cells below so that any reference is an absolute reference to cell B17. So let's have a look inside here. Okay, so here we have 1 plus B17, 1,000 times, 35,000 minus, 123,000 several divided by B17, etc. So this is showing that an absolute reference can be used in any type of formula, whether it's division, multiplication, addition, etc. So let's do them one by one and practice. So here we go. I'm going to highlight just the B17 and function F4. Now on the next one, highlight function F4. Here, function F4. Here, highlight just the reference, function F4. And here, function and F4. And just to note that when I have brackets there in my formula, it's just simple maths. It's like being back at school. The calculation between brackets is performed before the rest of the calculation by Excel. So now I have a absolute reference to B17 in all my formulas. So let's type in some numbers and see what happens. And then I can change that up as many times as I like. Oh, I'm not in the cell. And I can see that all my formulas keep changing and referring back to the fixed cell, which is B17. So here I'm asked to replace the letter X with an absolute reference to E17. Okay, so in this case, let's pick a number to put in as our absolute reference. And in this case, I've just thought of a quick way to do this. I'm going to highlight all my examples and press Control Find. And I'm going to pick X and I'm going to replace it with $B, $17. I'm going to not B17 because I'm actually working with E17 now. E17, replace all. Okay, and let's have a look at these. Yeah, I can see that my X is replaced with the reference here, and just to demonstrate that it all links in, we can see those change. So it's all very well knowing how to do an absolute reference, but it's no use to us if we can't find a practical application for it. So that's what we're going to have a look at here. So here's an extract from a project budget that we're preparing for a proposal. You can see it's Project Horizon, and we've completed the costs in local currency. Our local currency is called LOQ. And we now need to convert it to donor currency. And the donor has told us to use a rate of 1.23. So how do we apply this? Hopefully already some of you have realised that an absolute reference would be a very useful tool here for translating to donor currency. And that's what I've done in this example. So step one, I've entered my rate of exchange here, and that's the cell where my absolute reference will link to. Then, just as I've been doing before, I've entered my simple formula here, E7 times F1. Then I'm going to highlight F1 in the formula bar because that's where I want my absolute reference to be. Then as I press function F4, my dollar signs are applied. And now I can simply drag that formula down, and then I have my donor conversion. So we'll try that for ourselves on the sheet called currency conversion. So here's the currency conversion example, and the donor has given our rate of 1.23. So now I'm going to start in the cell where I want my first result to be. So equals, and I'm going to take my amount in local currency and multiply it by the donor rate here at F1. And now I'm going to highlight and function F4 to apply my dollar signs to make that fixed and hit enter. And now I find the cross, drag that down. And you can see that immediately, I'll just copy this total cost across as well, I have been able to convert my local currency to donor currency very quickly. And the advantage is that if then the donor said, actually, we'd want you to report it at 1.25, I can change that really quickly. So quick currency conversion was one use for an absolute reference. Let's see where else it can add value for us. So in this example, we have completed a budget for year one of a project. However, we now want to forecast that out to 5 years. And we could use an absolute reference here to factor in inflation to help us make a forecast estimate. So here we have assumed that year on year inflation is 3%, 3.5%, or 4.5%. And then we've added a formula to inflate the costs in year 2. So let's have a look at that formula in closer detail. So I've taken E7, which is the year 1 of the budget, and I've then multiplied it by something that's within brackets. So I've multiplied it by 100% plus the percentage inflation here, which was F3. Yeah. So now if I drag that down, all of year 2 is going to be multiplied by 103% of year 1. And then I can move forwards, and in year 3, I can take year 2 and inflate that by 3.5%, etc. So go and have a go at that yourself on the sheet called forecast, and we'll run through it together afterwards. So here's that exercise, and let's run through it together. So here I'm going to start with my formula. So I want to take my year 1 amount, E10, and I want to multiply it by, it's going to be 100% plus the inflation. So I need to open a bracket, and I'm going to type in 100%, add my inflation given here, and now I'm going to close my brackets. And because I want this to be my absolute reference and fixed, I'm going to do function F4, and now I have my dollar signs around it. I hit enter. And now I am going to drag that down. And here I'm going to enter it from scratch again so that we get used to this formula. Equals, now I want the year 2 result, and I'm going to multiply it, but I need brackets, 100%, add this time G6, and close brackets. And now I'm going to highlight and add my dollar signs, and I'm going to drag that one down, and that one is referencing the G6 inflation each time. I'll do it once more here. G10 times 100%, add this 4% this time. And now I'm going to highlight function F4 and drag down. And finally, let's look at year 5. I'm going to multiply my year 4 result times 100%, add this one here, and I'm going to highlight function F4, hit enter, and drag down. And so now I have a quick forecast for 5 years. Now, if we wanted to change the inflation rates because maybe we have better information, or we want to do a best case and a worst case scenario, we can just amend the inflation rates and all the formulas will automatically update. So let's say that our best estimate is that we will have just 2% each year. And so now we would have an updated forecast ending in 141 in year 5. And let's say that our worst case scenario is 5% each year. And now our worst case scenario would end on 159,000 in year 5. So that is quite a nice way to be able to do quick forecasts and estimates. And this function of using 100% plus the percentage here is a very useful formula to help with forecasting. Maybe when you tried that last exercise, you might have tried to copy the formula across to the next column. But what we need to remember is that when the dollar signs are applied, the reference is fixed. And so if you drag it across or copy and paste it to a new place, that fixed reference will not change in the formula. Okay, so let's just demonstrate that. So here I might have happily done my formula for year 2. And I think, well, actually, I can just drag that across. So let me drag it across and see what happens. So here, this is fine. It's 100%, add the 3%, and that's exactly what we want. And then in year 3, whilst it is referencing the correct year, it is still referring back to this 3% because that cell F6 has been fixed by the dollar signs. Yep. So it's super important, as I always say, just to review and check that Excel is giving you what you expected, because Excel is intelligent, it's working on predictions, it's working on the information given. But in this case, if you forget that this is a fixed reference, it is creating an incorrect formula and an incorrect result for you. So in this case, we could, of course, then just amend these to say, actually, it was G6 that I wanted. And here it was actually H6 that I wanted. And here it was I6 that I wanted. And now, if I copied all of these down, I'd be back to the same results. So far, we have just been using the absolute reference with 2 dollar signs that fixes the entire cell reference. So we've been using this format here, which means that the column A is fixed and that row 1 is fixed. So the entire cell reference is fixed. But we could choose instead to fix only the column or only the row. And so in this example here, you can see that the column is free and the row is fixed. And in this example here, just the column is fixed, but the row is free. And if the column or the row is free, that makes a difference when you start dragging your formulas, because the row or the column reference will change, but the other one will remain fixed. So in our last example, when we dragged the formula across, it didn't produce the results we wanted. And that was because the entire cell reference was fixed. But let's look at it again and see how we can make it work by fixing just the row reference. And in this example, it is the row that we want fixed because the inflation rate is appearing in the same row each time. But the columns change and we want the column reference to move forward 1 each time. So we can amend our formula and remove the dollar sign in front of the column reference F, so that now we've just fixed the row. And now when we copy the formula, the column will change each time. So let's demonstrate that. So here we had our formula fixed at F6, but with both the column and the row fixed. So now let's remember that we actually don't want to fix the column. We want that to move forward. So in each of these cases, just to get used to the function, I will delete manually each time the $ from the column reference. And now let's highlight and let's drag that formula across. And now let's have a look. Well, I think 151 was the result we got before, so that's good. And now I can see that here, let's try one in the middle, that G6 is referencing the previous column. That's exactly what we wanted, isn't it? Here we have, yep, it's moved forward to the 4%, which is what we wanted. And finally, we have H11 times 100% plus column I's inflation rate. So that is just what we wanted. So watching those examples, it may seem quite difficult to understand and quite tricky. It's actually easier to start understanding it once you start working through these examples yourself. So there's a couple to try now on fixed row or column. Have a go yourself, and then we'll run through those exercises together again. So these exercises, they look like they could be complicated, but if we just focus on what we've been learning, we can see that we can unravel them and answer them very simply. So in this exercise, we've been given a summary of month-by-month data in local currency, LOQ, and we've been asked to convert these costs to donor currency, DON, using the mid rates each month, and these mid rates have been provided here. So let's start putting together a formula that will do this for me. So I'm going to do equals, and I want to take my activities in local currency and multiply it by the donor rate. And I'm going to hit enter. Now I want to think about dragging that across and dragging that down. But it's the row 6, that has the mid rates in, and I want row 6 fixed each time. So in front of my 6, I'm going to insert a $. And now let's drag that down. And let's check that these make sense to me. So this one now is office costs times the rates. Yeah, that's perfect. That's what I want. Let's drag this one across and see if these formulas make sense. So let's experiment with this one here. Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted, isn't it? And so now I'm confident that I can also drag these across. I'll just check one more to illustrate. Yeah, that is multiplied by that. And very simply, I've done the conversion of my summary data from local to donor currency. So in this example, we've been asked to split these salaries here across various projects by these percentages given. So let's start putting together a formula that will help with this. So here I'm going to go equals my salary, and I'm going to multiply it by the percentage given. Now, when I drag this formula down, we know that I want the data in the cells in row 4 to remain fixed. So in my formula, I'm going to make sure that here I fix my row 4 reference by doing a $. Okay. And now I need to think about what will happen when I drag it to the right. Well, let's have a look, shall we? So when I drag it to the right, my percentage has changed, and that's correct. But instead of now referencing the salary, my formula is referencing D6 because it's moved along. And so actually, I wanted the salaries in column C to remain fixed. So let's, oops, didn't mean to do that. So let's delete those formulas and have a look at this one again. So we know that we have sorted out the percentage part of our formula, but we also need to fix here the column that holds the salaries. So I will now fix column C with a $sign. And now I'm going to drag my formula down and I'm going to drag it across. And now I need to just review to check it's given the results that I wanted. And a quick way is if I add these up and have a look here in my quick sum, 8,000, and that was the amount I wanted to split. So it's split correctly between the different projects. 10,600, split of 10,600, I'm happy. So that was a very quick way of completing that percentage allocation. So hopefully we've seen that absolute reference can be very useful in our finance work. It's neat, it's quick, it reduces the chance of error. It's necessary to learn this so that we can move on now to our VLOOKUP function. But I've also tried to show you some practical applications for absolute reference on its own. And today we looked at currency conversion, percentage splits, and forecasting rates, where absolute reference can be very useful. So now we're going to move on to VLOOKUP. And as I explained at the beginning of the course, the VLOOKUP is a cross-referencing tool, and it searches a table of data to find the result you want to drag into another piece of work. And I want you to understand how VLOOKUP can be useful, because again, it is hard to conceptualize without looking at examples. So here we have an extract from a chart of accounts. These are balance sheet accounts. A quick aside on chart of account, hopefully everybody here today knows what we're talking about by a chart of account. But if you don't, it's an index of all the financial accounts in the organisation, and it's used by accountants on spreadsheets or in accounting systems to order and aggregate transactions. So here's our extract. We've got our fixed assets and our account number and the account name. We've got our cash and we've got our debtors. Let's say that management asks us for a summary of cash balances as at the 28th of February. And this is the format that your accounting system has provided. Now, what are the problems with sending it as it is? Well, hopefully you can see that unless management also have a list of what each account code means, they're not really going to know what each balance means. You know, it's in code to them, it's not names. And it would be much more informative, especially for non-finance staff, with the account names rather than the account numbers. So how do we add in the account names? Well, we could keep going back to our chart of accounts and we could copy, Control-C, and then we could go back and we could Control-V, and we could keep pasting in each of the items. But actually, this is the job that VLOOKUP can do for you in an automated way so that it's less time consuming and so that the risk of manual error is reduced. So let's have a look at how VLOOKUP can do that job for us. So the first thing we're looking at is how to access, how to find the VLOOKUP function. So step one is to insert a column where we want the new information to be added. And it's very important that this must be a column somewhere to the right of the information that you are cross-referencing to. So in our example, we want to find the account name. So we have inserted a column for that, and it is somewhere to the right of the account number, which is the reference that we will be using to look up the data from. Step 2, we can start in the cell where we want the first formula to be. And then in the formula bar, if we press the function button, we bring up our box here and we can search for VLOOKUP. So let's just have a look at that. So here we have the cash balances data. And step 1, I was going to insert a new column where the information that I want to look up will land. So here I'm going to right click, insert, and I'm looking for the account name. And I'm just going to widen that as I know the name will be a bit wider. And so now I want to access the VLOOKUP function. So I'll start in the cell where I want my first formula to be. And I'm going to press on the function button. And I'm going to find the VLOOKUP formula. So if I can't find it, if I start to type it here, VLOOKUP and search. And there I have it, okay. And so now I have my VLOOKUP function box and I'm ready to start putting the formula together. So there were 4 sections in that formula box, and we'll have a look at the definitions of them, and then we'll do the practical example. So first of all, the lookup value. So this is the reference that you want to add the new information to. So you want to look at another source and drag in information from there. So in our example, we already have the account codes as the reference, but we want to drag in more information relating to those codes. So the cells containing the account codes are the references that we need in this section of the formula. In this case, they are our lookup value. The next section of the function is the table array. And this is a table from where the data you are looking for is retrieved. So in our example, we want to retrieve account names. So we will need to reference a table where the account codes and the account names are stored together. The third in the function is the column index number. And this is the column that contains the data you want to retrieve. So in our example, the column we want to retrieve data from is the column that contains the account names. Finally, we have the range lookup, and we just insert the word false in this field every time. Entering false means that the formula returns an exact match. And for the work that we as accountants do, really it's that exact match that we want. Entering true finds the closest match, but it's not really valuable for the work that we're doing. So in our example, in any example, we're just going to enter the word false. Entering false or true are actually our only options in that field, but we'll narrow it down to just one option and write false every time. Let's look at each of those fields in closer detail. So the first one was the lookup value. And as we said, this is the reference that you want to add new information to. So in our example, here it's the account number, and we want to add more information to that. So our lookup value is going to be A4. So to get that into the field, we're simply going to click on A4. Next, we move on to the table array. And this is the table from where the data we are looking for is retrieved. So the table should be in a different worksheet. It can even be in a different workbook. The rule, however, is that the data must be arranged in a table format, just like the table formats that we've been focusing on in previous courses. So by now, as long as we're arranging data in nice tables, we're going to have table arrays that can be used within a VLOOKUP formula. So we're going to click in the table array box in the pop-up box. Then we're going to move to the worksheet where the table data is. And we're going to use Control, Shift and arrows, just like we've learned before, to highlight the table data so that the column that we want to look up from is in the far left-hand column of the highlighted data. So that's easier to illustrate if we look at this snapshot here. So here we see that we are within the table array box. So step one is just to make sure that you've clicked into that field and are working in it. Step two then is to go to the worksheet where the table data is. And in our example here, the table is in COA extract for notes example. Step three, we've done our Control, Shift, arrow, and we've highlighted the table data that we want to use. And this table contains on the far left of the highlighted area, the data that we want to look up to, the data that we have already, which is the account numbers. And then we've also highlighted the account name, because that is the data that we want to pull out of this table into the sheet we are working on. And then I just noted here that actually the actual sheet we're working on, the cash balances, is actually here. So you can see that at the moment we're working here to pull in our our balance names, but this is where the table is. Let's look at those steps so far in Excel. So first of all, we have accessed our function. I'll type it in again. VLOOKUP. I'll search for it. There we go. Okay. And now I have the pop-up box with all the parts of my function. So first of all, the lookup value, and what we're using as our lookup value is the account number. So I'm going to click on the account number, and you can see that that is now referenced in my formula. Next, I'm going to click in the table array box, and on this one, I need to find the table where I can retrieve the data from. So I know it's in this sheet here, and so I am going to highlight the table, and I've made sure that the account number is my far left-hand column. You'll note there's another column here, but I've ignored it because I want to highlight making sure that the account number is my far left-hand column. Now let's move back and learn about the final two parts of the formula. So far, when we've been using tables and Excel in general, in fact, we've been thinking about columns only in terms of A, B, C, D, because they're in alphabetical order. However, in VLOOKUP, we think about tables a little differently because we only think about the columns of a table that we really need. So in this table, the lookup value must be in the far left-hand column, which it is. And the column where we want to retrieve the data from is in column 2 of the table. So in our VLOOKUP function, we're not going to reference a letter for a column. We're going to reference the number of column where the data that we want to retrieve is. So in the example that we're looking at, our column index number would be 2. I can help explain this a little more by looking at this example here. Say we were using this in the same formula. Our account number is now here in column 1 again, in the far left-hand column, because that's where it has to be, in the far left-hand column. But the account name that we want to retrieve is now over here. But it's not column H that we refer to in the formula. We need to count how many columns that information is in the table and enter that as our column index number. So here from column 1, this is column 2, column 3, column 4, column 5, column 6, column 7. So in this example, it would be 7 as our column index number. And so here, when we type the column index number that we need, we see it added to the formula here. And then we're going to click into our final box, the range lookup. And as I mentioned before, we're simply going to add the word false into the box. And we can see that that is also now present in the formula. So let's complete those steps. So here we are, we've now done our lookup value and our table array. We now know that our column index is, let's have a look back at the table where it is, our column index 1, 2. So our column index is simply 2. And in our range lookup, we're going to write false and OK. So now we have a formula and you can see that it's retrieved a result to say account name LOQ current account, which is far more useful for a user of the information to know that that's the balance on our current account rather than that's the balance on 1100. So you might be happy and think we've finished, I'm going to drag that formula down, but there is a very important final step in the formula. And this is why we've been learning absolute references, because we need to fix the table reference using an absolute reference. So currently the formula that we saw is this. Here's the lookup value, then this is where our table array is. So what we need to do is highlight the cell references for the table array and add our dollar signs. So we're going to need to highlight B3 to C11 and add our dollar signs to fix the coordinate of the table as an absolute reference. Why do we need to do it? We're going to learn about that in just a little bit. But let's finalize our VLOOKUP formula by adding in the dollar references. And again, you can see that there's an exclamation mark in front and a comma afterwards. So you need to be very careful in just capturing the cell references that you need. And then I'm going to add function F4. And now I can take my small black cross and drag that down. And there I have some results that show me the account names because they've looked it up from each account number. And now I could send that to a manager to look at and review and understand without an issue. So I'll just delete that and we'll just run through all those steps again. So first of all, I inserted a column where I want my new data to be. And I'm going to call it account name, because that's what I'm looking up. I'm just going to make it a bit wider so that I'll be able to read those names. Now I'm going to start my formula equals, and I'm going to search here for my VLOOKUP function. There we go. And now my lookup value is I want to use the account numbers to look up something else. On my table array, I'm now going to highlight the table where the data is on the far left-hand column, and that also includes the data that I want to retrieve. I'm going to count here 1, 2. So my column index is 2. My range lookup is false, and I hit enter, but I'm not quite done. The final step is to highlight my table reference and press function F4 to get my dollar signs. And now I can drag that formula down to have my results. In your notes, there's a summary of those steps to follow in case you get lost. So use those steps to have a go at these exercises here on the sheets, cash balances and lookup actuals. So the first exercise was the one that we were using in our notes. So I'm going to insert, type in account name, and then I'm going to bring up my formula using equals and the formula bar, and then I'm going to select my function. My lookup value is my account number, which is referenced to A7. My table array is in this sheet here, so I'm going to highlight my table that I need. The column I need is 1, 2, so it's column 2, and I'm going to press false. And now the final all-important step is to highlight just that cell reference, function F4, enter, cross and drag down. The second exercise, this says here is the format that the donor requires a report in. Okay, so that's realistic because sometimes the donor gives you a template and it doesn't exactly match what is coming out of your accounting system. So we can use a VLOOKUP formula to add in the actuals to date. Okay, so we've got the budget here, and clearly I obviously need to do a update to the donor on the actuals against budget. So I have all my costs for the project to date here, and they've come out of my accounting system and they're not quite in the format that the donor wants. So let's try and tidy this up. So let's start here where I want my formula. So I'll press equals and go to my function bar and use my VLOOKUP. Now I'm going to be using my, let's have a check. Let's see what I've got. So I could use my account number, or I could even use my account name here, but I think it's safer to use my account number. So I will use my account number. Let's get that correct. So I'm going to click on account code here. My table array is in this sheet here where all my costs to date are. So I'm going to make sure that my account number is in my far left-hand column, and I'm going to highlight here, and then control arrow down. And the column that I want, the column index number, So this is column 1, 2, 3. So I want column 3, and I'm going to type in false. Final important step, highlight and function F4 to fix that table reference. And now I'm going to drag this down. And immediately I can see that I have my costs populated. Now, interestingly, I have these NAs come up. Why has this come up? Well, that's because that is referencing this blank here, and I don't have that blank. So I could just delete these because there's no need for those to be there. Another way I could delete them is to use a filter like we've learned in previous course. So if I applied a filter here to my data, I could actually filter on the NAs, and then I could just delete those, which has meant that this total formula now works. And now if I bring all my numbers back, I now very quickly have a really lovely little donor report that I'm ready to review or send to the donor, etc. So I'll just do that one more time to show you those steps, because it's a really useful technique to know. So we did our lookup formula. We did equals, function, VLOOKUP, and we used our, I'll tell you what, I'll use our names this time. Our table array is over here in horizon costs to date, but this time we're going to start at account name. So I'll highlight my table, and this time the column index I want is column 1, column 2. So I just want column 2, and I'm going to press false. Okay, not finished yet. Add in my absolute reference, function F4, hit enter, and now I'm going to drag that all the way down. And now, just to get rid of my NAs, I'm going to apply filters, and I'm going to filter on just my NAs, and I'm just going to get rid of those by highlighting them and deleting them. And now I have a donor report ready for review. I want to look at a few things that can go wrong when we use VLOOKUP formulas. So the first thing is not applying an absolute reference. So here's an example. I have a list of conference attendees on one sheet, and I want to find out what hotel they're staying in, and I have that information on a different sheet. So if I do a VLOOKUP formula correctly, I know that my table array is going to end here at row 15. And so here I've fixed it as A3 to C15. Okay, and that's correct. But what happens if I don't fix the table array? Well, these are the results that we obtained when we did not fix the table array. So you can see that we've got some errors here. And if you have errors, you also think, can I trust the whole thing? And you can see here that there's no $sign. So what has happened is that in this cell now here, this formula is A5 to C17. So it's referencing the table A5 to C17 because there's been no fixed reference. And so as you've dragged the formula down, the reference for the table array has also changed each time. And we know from above that the data ends at row 15. And so if this formula is now referencing row 17, there's nothing for it to look at. And the same has happened with these items here. And I've just tried to expand the formulas here for you to see. So in row 10, A10, this is now looking up A9 to C21. This is looking up A10 to C22. This is looking up A11 to C23. There's nothing for it to find, and so hence you're getting errors returned to you. So to illustrate that in our version here, so if I do my VLOOKUP formula equals access the function bar, I'm going to use this name as a reference point. Then I'm going to click into my table array, and my table array is over here, and I need these two columns, and my column index is column 1, column 2, so I want column 2, and I'm going to press false. And so I've done a really good job, and now I forget to apply my absolute reference, and I drag it down, and there we have the errors. And if I look here, A10 is looking up A9 to B21, and if I look here, A9 to B21 would mean that it was looking up to this table here, and in fact for the line that we are on for Adeline, you can see that Adeline isn't, we're not going to find a result for Adeline because Adeline is no longer in that table because the table reference has moved down. But of course, we can save ourselves. We can just go back in to the formula and we can manually adjust to highlight and function F4, apply the absolute, and now we can drag down and correct it again. Another important issue to be aware of when using VLOOKUP tables is when you have non-unique or repeated references in the table array data. So in this example here, I have a list of hotels and I want to find out their accommodation costs. And the table array that I want to use is here. And you can see that here is the first appearance of Hotel A. Another important issue to be aware of is the use of non-unique or repeated references in the table array data. So in this example, I have a list of hotels and I want to look up their accommodation costs. And here is the table array that I'm going to use. And you can see here is the first appearance of Hotel A, but it's also repeated here, 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 here. Here is the first appearance of Hotel B. It's also repeated here. Hotel C is here, but also repeated here, here, etc. So now, even if we use a completely correct formula, we can see it's here. We've put in the absolute reference. But the results we get back, all that Excel can do in this case is bring back the result from the first matching item in the list. So I've just used the colours here to illustrate, but for example, for Hotel A here, it has brought back 230, which is the value for the first time that Hotel A appears in the list. For Hotel B, Each time it has brought back 180, which you can see is for the first time that Hotel B appears in the list, even though that later on in the list the value is different. For Hotel C, again, it's brought back 175. And if we look, Hotel C's first appearance is at 175, even though the next one, etc., goes on to 255. So in this case, what's happened really is that the table array is not adequate to perform the VLOOKUP formula because it does not have unique references in it. So just be wary of that when using the VLOOKUP function. Another frequent error is using the wrong column index. And let's have a look at this example here. If we have our account number here in column B, which is column 1, and we want to bring back our account name, what number column index do we want to use? Now, looking at it, you may see 1, 2, 3, 4 columns, but if we bring our focus here, we can see that actually there's column D, E, F, which are not in the alphabetical sequence and which are hidden. Even though they're hidden, they're still present and they still count as columns that you need to count in your index function. So despite the fact that they're hidden, the account name is actually sitting not in column 4, which we can see with our visible eye, but it's actually sitting in column 7. So 7 would be the column index number to use in our formula. Another thing we need to be wary of is when there is non-identical text or numerical data. And we saw a little bit about the problems that this can cause in pivot tables too. If Excel sees 2 different spellings, it will aggregate them as 2 different rows, even though maybe we wanted them together. And text may look identical to the eye, but if there's any difference, Excel will spot it and identify it as a different spelling. So in this example, I have looked up my hotels for my conference attendees. And whilst it looks like Adeline's name is absolutely fine, what has happened is that there is a space at the end. And so because in the table array, there was no space at the end of the name, a non-applicable error has been returned. In the second case, there's just an extra space in the middle. And in the third case for Alban, there is a space at the beginning. So tricky to spot, but if you get an NA error and you can't understand it, that is something to investigate. So the final thing to be aware of is that, you know, sometimes an item won't be found simply because it wasn't in the table array. And in the course on financial reporting, we'll look at how to investigate these missing items by using VLOOKUPs to perform a 2-way reconciliation. But for now, just bear it in mind as something to be aware of. So we're at the end, but we're going to do a skills consolidation. It will also revise pivot tables from last time, and we'll have a look at it, and it incorporates. So the final thing to be aware of is that sometimes you might get an NA error simply because the item that you're looking for was not in your table array. And in the next course on financial reporting, We will look at how to investigate missing items by using VLOOKUPs to perform a kind of two-way reconciliation. But for now, if you get an NA error, just bear in mind that that could be one of the causes. So that's all for today. We're now going to do an exercise that is going to consolidate today's skills, learning about absolute references and VLOOKUPs. And we're also going to combine it with a little bit of revision on pivot tables. So go to your data and read the instructions in the exercise Consolidate 1. So here's the exercise. Let's take a look. So firstly, I'm just going to scroll down and see what I'm dealing with. And actually, I've got quite a lot of transactions. And you know what? I've already forgotten what each of these columns was. And so I definitely want to freeze my panes. So I'm already in the view ribbon. So I'm going to freeze my panes here. And now when I drag down, I can see more clearly what I'm dealing with. And point 1 also asks me to put filters on, which is always a good idea, because then if I've got any errors to correct, etc., I can work with my filters. So in my data ribbon, I'll apply my filters. So that is point 1 done. Number 2, on this sheet, use VLOOKUP to add in the account names. The account names is on the sheet chart of account. Okay, so let's have a look at that chart of account sheets. And here I can see I have my account names, and here is the account numbers. Okay, so first of all, I need to insert a column, and I'm going to call that account names. And now I'm ready to do my VLOOKUP. So I'm going to press equals, and I'm going to access the function through my function key. My lookup value is this one here for the account number, B10. My table array, I was told, was in chart of account. So I need my account number in the far left-hand column. And I need to include my account name because that's where I'm retrieving my result from. So I shall highlight all that data. And I want column 1, column 2. So I want column 2. Then I'm going to type in false, hit enter, but I know I'm not finished. I need to highlight my table reference, and I'm going to press function F4 to insert my $ to make it an absolute reference. And I hit enter. I'm just going to use the skill I learned on how to widen my column just so that I can read that account name clearly. Oh, I'll just take that back to a readable size, hey? Now let's drag that formula down with our cross. And we can see now that we have the account names for each of the categories. And I'm just going to use my filter to check whether there were any NA errors. And if I look, I can see that they've all worked actually. There's no NA errors, there's no blanks. So I've got a really successful lookup there. That's great. So now I need to summarize the data by account name. And I've given us a hint there to use a pivot table. So hopefully people can remember how to do this. So step 1 of the pivot table was to highlight the table data that we want to convert into a pivot table. I'm inserting the pivot table, so I find that on the insert ribbon of Excel. I'm going to insert pivot table. And if you remember here, I just simply press OK. That takes me to a new sheet. And I wanted to summarize by account name. That's what I was asked to do. So I'll drag account name into my rows, and it was the amounts I wanted to summarize. So I will drag them into values. But just looking ahead, there's one more thing I need to do, because I also want to keep in this case, my account category. Yeah. So there I have my office costs and my salaries nicely summarized by value. Now, as I want to keep this data, I'm going to name my sheets. I'm going to call this summary table. Okay, so now let's go back and see what we've done. So we've done number 3. And then number 4, complete the template on the sheet, consolidate skills 2 to split costs by account name across the 3 projects as shown. So it looks like here I want to have my account names and my costs, and then I can apply these percentage splits. Okay, so let's look back at my summary table. Now, why I added these in is so that I can split between my office costs and salaries, because I've seen that that's what I need to do. So I think I will take my office costs and I will copy them using Control C, and I can paste them in here with Control V. I think what I might do though is just add another column here and add this to remind myself that they're the office costs. And now I'm doing salaries. And so here I go back to my pivot table, which I can find easily because I named it. And I'm going to copy these using Control C. I'm going to put these now using Control V into my table here. And now I need to apply my percentage splits. So I'm going to start by adding a formula to help me. So the first thing I want to do is I want to take this cost, which is an office cost, and I want to multiply it by 40% for Project CView. Okay. Now, if I'm moving across, the row for the percentage split is actually going to stay the same. So the percentage is in D6 and the row is going to stay the same. So I'm going to apply a $sign there to fix that. As I move it across, I also want to make sure that the column stays fixed as column C, because I'm splitting that column by the percentages. So I will also fix here column C with a $sign. And now I can happily take my percentages across and down, but I'm only taking them as far as my office costs, because I need to apply a different percentage to my salaries. So I'll just do a quick check. So my total office costs were 192,605, and my split now is 192,605. So that's great. That gives me some comfort that I've applied my formulas correctly. So now I'll use this formula as a base. But let's have a look. Now, that's not what I want anymore, is it? Because now I actually want to be using row 5's splits. So I'm going to amend this one to 5. But because I've already fixed column C, the rest of it is actually still okay. So I'll take that across and down. And I'll just do a final little check here. So the total was 118,109, and here it's 118,109. And I think I'm just going to finish this off by tidying it up with a comma divider and some rounding so that it looks nice. And then I'm going to add a total, because I think if I've gone to all the effort of doing this, I probably want to know what my totals are by project. So I'll go back and I'll use my auto sum, and there Excel has happily guessed the right result for me. And then I think I might just make that bold. And as these are totals, I'll put a totals border around them. And there we go. I'm happy with that. So that is all for today. Practice, practice, practice. And I'll see you again for our next course.